Hey, Mr. Sunday, thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Sunday, I'm always struck when people talk about things like intangible drilling costs as being some big bailout for a super major. But as you and I both know, they don't qualify for the intangible drilling cost deduction. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. It's more limited to the independents.
And specifically only 1,000 barrels a day, which for ExxonMobil is, with one, they don't qualify, but two, it would not be very important on their overall production. Now, that would be very important for the small independent producer who diversifies, if you will, prevents the monopoly of the super majors and the larger independents. So, how essential is such a thing for that smaller producer who is creating such prosperity for working Americans in your state?
Thanks for the question, Senator. Our natural gas resources have been a huge win for the economy and environment, but it's a challenge price environment because of infrastructure constraints and regulations. So the folks that are still able to sustain are those independents, but their business structure is 85% of their CapEx is intangible drilling costs. That's what we call it for that industry. In other industries, it's
So let me just stop you because I have
yeah,
limited time. So the
sure.
point is all these folks who are providing great paying jobs for working Americans, great paying jobs that have persisted despite the pandemic, they are dependent upon this particular provision, which doesn't go to ExxonMobil, but does go to these very small companies in some cases, and they're the ones providing this employment. I want to make that point. Mr. Brill, I'm always interested in the carbon tax because it seems as if it leaves various things out. By the way, I think philosophically, you and I are in agreement on many things. But we know, let's just be honest, we're not going to have battery production on the scale that is required for this vision of the administration for at least a decade, if not a lot longer. Now, and we also know that currently most of the batteries are produced in China, where they use coal as feedstock, and the cobalt is mined in the Congo with abhorrent conditions, a very energy intensive process. So when we do and I've read that if you take into account the mining of the cobalt, the processing in China, and the shipment of the battery to the US, that the amount of savings in life cycle cost on global greenhouse gas emissions is minimal and perhaps even non existent. So, as we do and by the way, hear that it is minimal or non existent. So, everybody who looks at EVs as kind of the savior of the environment is looking at US emissions. They're not looking at global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we had more time, we could develop that further. Mr. Brill, though, in your carbon tax, aren't we effectively outsourcing the carbon release to China and India, et cetera, unless we're going to put a border adjustment tax, which takes into account the mining of the cobalt in with the equipment that is used in the Congo, the shipping cost to China, the concrete that's laid in China, et cetera. Is that practical?
Thank you for your question, Senator. You're absolutely right that in a well-designed carbon tax, there needs to be a border adjustment mechanism that would exclude the tax on U.S. exports of carbon-intensive goods and impose that tax on imports of goods containing carbon from other countries. That policy is something that tax lawyers and tax economists have thought about a lot, and it can protect the U.S. competitiveness.
No, I accept, we both accept the need for the border adjustment tax. Is it practical if you're going to have heavy equipment in the Congo, which is going to be, scraping this out of the ground, putting it in a diesel spewing truck to take it to the port, to ship it to China with a 60% coal fired energy source, and then shipped over here? Not to mention the fact that the factories in China are made with lots of concrete and other vessels, other trucks spewing diesel. How practical is it to have a BAT which totally captures all that?
My view, Senator, is that it is definitely possible to capture most of the trade in carbon emissions from a border
Now,
adjustment
just for a
tax.
second, Mr. Brill, everything's possible. Is it practical? I mean, are we
Yes.
really going to get the diesel truck that's 20 years old in the Congo bringing the stuff used by child labor to the port?
I'm not suggesting that it can capture 100% of the carbon emissions involved in trade, but I do believe that one could practically design a policy that captures the vast majority of traded carbon emissions.
I'm over time, but I will say that it's in the interest of our trading partners to bury those costs. And so I do think the practicality of it may be subject to definition. But thank you all for your testimony.